Dr. Jones. Thank you so much for coming back and joining us.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for having me back. It's I'm looking forward to many more episodes with you and exploring this amazing GLP-1 world.
Well, it's evident from the last video that you have an enormous fan base, and the love for you was, as you could see from the comments, was deep.
Yeah, no, and it's very rewarding, and it definitely makes my day to see that.
But there was a couple of questions that were brought up. I wanted to give you the opportunity to answer if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, first one. Dr. Jones is awesome. His stance on GLP-1s is controversial. He advocates for lifestyle change, diet resistance training, and optimal metabolic health. My question to you is I don't understand why that's controversial. I know that you get it in your lives a lot, people coming in and thinking that you're representing diet culture, but explain to people why taking these steps shouldn't necessarily be a controversial thing.
Yeah, and truth be told, I can only guess that individual comment, but I'd like to think I probably know where she's coming from. And I think we did touch on this a little bit, but it's such an important concept that this narrative, I think, is where this comes from. The narrative that obesity and diabetes are just chronic, irreversible diseases, and when you accept that narrative, it really does change the entire landscape. It changes what even what how you should approach the medication, and what you should consider, and what sort of obligations or responsibilities you bestow upon the individual, right? Because if it really was a chronic irreversible disease, well, then that's unfair to say, hey, you need to do all these lifestyles. It just changes everything. It really does. And so I really think that's the big thing that creates questions like that and confusion like that. And what's fueling this, obviously, is the fact that the research that was done on these medications was done with that narrative in mind. This is a chronic irreversible disease, which I think is hilarious because, obesity not too long ago was completely the fault of the individual. And, it's just hilarious how money can really quickly change perspectives. But nonetheless, it's like, yeah, I think that's ultimately, we don't even need to expand on it. I think that's the issue. And so it is controversial because what I'm advocating for is what you would do logically if you didn't believe this was a chronic irreversible disease.
Yeah,
So
no, I agree. And what the next question that came in is interesting. And it says, my cousin is a patient of this doctor. She's severely metabolically broken with severe insulin resistance. She's about 5 foot tall, 60 years old, and probably weighs close to 500 pounds. She's able to walk 20 feet from the walker to use the restroom and then sits back down. She's severely metabolically dysregulated, and she is not even on a GLP-1 medication. He has her doing, Dr. Jones, has her doing a sardine diet for 3 days and then fasting for 72 hours. He talks about this stuff being sustainable. This is not sustainable. So it sounds fishy. Are you making people do a sardine diet?
no pun intended, right? No, thank you for allowing me to respond to this. No, we don't have sardine diets in any part of my protocols. Although I'm going to say, I think the concept of a sardine diet is actually, um, to not go too far down. I think if you put someone on a literal diet of just sardines, I think they would actually do pretty well comparatively. But I want to be clear. I'm just pointing that out because I think it's comical. But no, absolutely not. That's not part of any of our protocols. I do love sardines, though. I like to personally eat them with hot sauce and vinegar and salt. That's how the three ingredients make sardines so much more delicious for me. But yeah, somebody like that, I do feel like we would eventually get them to the point where we can get them fasting, where we can get them moving in that direction. But it's going to take time. I mean, somebody that metabolically just out of it, so obese, so insulin resistant, that even intermittent fasting might be very challenging. It would have to be a case by case. We would have to see what the patient can tolerate. What happens if you skip a meal? She might actually, believe it or not, be able to do intermittent fasting. She might not. but wherever she's at, we would start at the appropriate level. And the appropriate level before you get into any fasting, if you can't even tolerate simply intermittent fasting, which would be eating a little bit later in the day instead of, your typical 8 or 9, maybe pushing it 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. The prerequisite to that would be keto, just simply lowering your carbohydrate intake and replacing it with healthy fats. You can do that for however long it takes and throw some fiber and some exogenous ketones, and you can get that person to the point where they can start fasting, which would be sort of the next level up. But thank you for allowing me to distinguish the Dr. Jones puts people on sardine diets.
So just to be clear, we're not doing an all sardine diet over there?
No sardine diets, but I other than me saying I love delicious sardines, and they could be a great healthy snack for anybody.
And she had a second part to her question. I wanted to break it up into two so you can address each one separately. It says not to diminish his weight loss and struggles with weight, because you had mentioned that you'd lost over 100 pounds. We cannot compare a young guy who has lost 100 pounds of weight loss over a few years while he was still a teenager or in his 20s to a woman that has PCOS, hyperthyroidism, pre-diabetic, has been obese for more than 50 years, is apples to oranges. I actually like this question a lot because, externally you are a very fit young man. And people come into your lives and like, who the hell is this guy coming into our space telling us what to do? What the hell does he know about being obese and being an older person? Look at him. He's fit. I gravitated towards you for this exact reason. The person that I want a part of my team, like I wouldn't choose a dentist that didn't have any teeth. I wouldn't have a financial advisor who had a gambling problem. So how do you respond to people? Because I know this is not the first time you've gotten this question. How do you respond to people that come into your lives and feel that you are completely non-relatable because of how you look?
Yeah, no, and it is not known by everybody that I have my own struggles, and so like she said, I lost 100 pounds way back when I was 16, but the thing that I think is so much more important for people to understand than just the fact that I lost 100 pounds. A lot of people lost 100 pounds, 200 pounds, but at that age, I couldn't keep it off, and for 8 years, that's why you'll see pictures of me that I have in some of my videos where I'm in my 20s and, I'm back to 250, 260 with a big old gut again. So I unfortunately was unable to maintain that weight loss, and it was a vicious cycle year in and year out. And, it fucking sucked. I mean, it sucks. And so I understand so well and all too familiar with this sort of like, I can't control my body. And my gosh, that creates such feelings of just like, what's wrong with me? And, instability and doubt. And, I kept the most positive outlook on it that I could. And just, this again, back in that day, this was before even fasting became a thing, let alone GLP-1s. And so I just thought that that's how it was. I just thought some people can just stay fit. Other people have to always work on it, like really, really like excessively and obsessively. And, and then lo and behold, all the deep fasting and metabolic health, I realized, oh, there's something here. There's this obesity thing. And, is obesity a disease? What's your definition of a disease? Does it, purely genetic? You can't do anything about it. It is a combo. And, I think obesity is a combo, and that percentage has a certain amount of it in your genetics, which you can't do anything about. And then there's a certain percentage of it that's outside of genetics that you can do something about. And so I think I have a huge ability to relate to people. And because I've been there and I've walked in the shoes of a 400-pound morbidly obese person who also has that instability and that inability to maintain their weight, obviously not to the same extent as someone like that, but year in and year out, because I didn't have the understanding back then. That's why I struggled for so long. So and look, not that I think you should only learn from somebody who literally has walked in your shoes. That if we only did that, that would also probably not be the best case scenario. But if you can work with somebody in whatever discipline or thing you're trying to get help with from somebody who's actually walked in your shoes, I think that's pretty cool too. So I absolutely can relate to that individual to a certain extent, from the perspective of I could not control my weight. I constantly zigzagged and yo-yoed. I finally achieved stability. now I've achieved an even higher level with GLP-1s of this fit level, being able to maintain a fit, because there's going from unhealthy to just healthy, and then there's, which that's all I want to get people towards. And then if anybody else wants to go to the like fit category, which is super cool, optimal and fit, I'm noticing now just in the past year and year and a half, I've been able to take healthy and somewhat lean to a whole new level with GLP-1 microdosing and things of that nature. So I also believe in if you're going to be a leader, that you absolutely should be the goddamn best that you can in that thing that you are leading in, because it sets an example. Anyways, I feel like maybe she just couldn't think with that, or hopefully she hears this message and she thinks with this, whatever she thinks with this, right? So, but for anybody else wondering, that's a little bit more of an understanding of kind of where I come from.
And I agree. I think that you want people a part of your team that are being example of what you want or what you wish to become, whether it's in full or in part. So I appreciate your stuff. It says, next question we have, it says, hi, Candace, longtime listener of Dr. Jones. He talks about fasting in his lives. How is this not just starving yourself to lose weight?
Oh man, I love this question. And like I said, we're going to do a pure fasting podcast. So I'm going to have to like really, it's harder for me to give brief summaries because I'm like, oh man, I want to really sink my teeth in it, but it's good practice. It's good practice for me too. So keeping it under a couple minutes, fasting is a type of caloric restriction. Okay. So you have this umbrella of caloric restriction, which, by the way, caloric restriction has a plethora of literature, and it's well established that restricting calories, while it's not everything, right? Obesity, we know it's more than just that. It's a huge piece of it, and promotes well-established improvements in multiple aspects of your health. So then what's fasting? So fasting is a type of caloric restriction. Fasting actually is the most extreme version by definition, because you can't restrict more than 0. So it's the most extreme version of restricting your calories. But what separates it is the defined period of time. Generally, and that gets really nuanced because there's so many types of fasting, but generally it's that extreme caloric restriction over a defined window. And just kind of quickly stating, the way that you do fasting correctly is that you have to balance the fasting window with something that's either a full-blown feast, which would be an excess, or at least hitting your TEE, total energy expenditure, having higher calorie days. And I use the word feasting because when you're on a GLP-1, eating 2,000 calories, which is really supposed to be the average for your average human, how many calories they should be eating at rest without a change in their weight, seems like feasting because they're on these powerful GLP-1 medications. So the caloric restriction, the large umbrella, fasting is a example of it. It's controlled. Starvation. Okay. Now this is really interesting. So starvation or starvation mode, there's starvation in the practical sense. God forbid, I'm locked in someone's basement and there's no food, right? Like for 2 weeks. That's full blown literal starvation. And then there's starvation mode, which is different. And I bring this up because some people will talk about, well, a person that's not the literal starvation, they're still losing weight. So starvation mode doesn't exist. And I'm like, no. You don't understand the difference between literal starvation, and I'm eating 1,000 calories. So if I'm eating 1,000 calories, again, average human, let's just say, should be doing about 2,000. You're eating 1,000. That'll create starvation mode. So starvation mode is a metabolic reaction. It's a survival instinct in humans to keep you alive. This is what our ancestors, they evolved better mechanisms to do this because they experienced, very, very large periods of time where they wouldn't eat. And this is also prevalent in the animal kingdom, obviously, right in front of us. So the ability for survival depends on this ability for the body to say, whoa, I need to down regulate. I need to crank down the metabolism. I need to slow things down at the expense of quality of life, which is why the symptoms, and I call it zombie mode, is brain fog, tiredness, constipation, feeling cold, achy body, all these things that comically come up to zombie mode, is literally your body saying, all right, if you're going to starve me, AKA eat 1,000 calories, half of the amount that you should be eating, I'm going to slow down my energy expenditure and figure out how to run off of less calories. So starvation mode, you could still be eating a freaking 1,000 calories. And if you're eating 1,000 and now your metabolism has slowed down to burning 1,000, there's no net change. Very, very different than I'm not eating any food. Metabolism has slowed down to as much as it possibly can, but your metabolism can never slow down to zero. You wouldn't be alive. So that's why the person would still lose weight when they are literally starving, as opposed to starvation mode. So fasting, when not done correctly, can absolutely create starvation mode. And in fact, I think a lot of times that's what's happened to people when they didn't know how to approach fasting, how to understand it, how to utilize it correctly. They just put themselves in starvation modes. But the starvation mode that we talked about, where they're eating 1,000, or arbitrary number. But with GLP-1 medications, you have this happening so much, and it's actually one of the biggest problems. If you ask me what are one of the top 2 or 3 problems with just GLP-1s in general, this is one of them, is that people are starting these medications and they're not being instructed on being cognizant and conscious over their caloric intake, even if they're estimating. And so without even knowing, unknowingly, they're slipping into the situation because there's no hunger, right? You're smashing that with the GLP-1s and you're starving, starvation mode. And so in summary, you have to know how to approach fasting because it's controlled by balancing it out with the appropriate amount of higher feed days, whether you call those feasting or high calorie days. And that goes back to the title of my book, being Fast, Feast, and Flourish, because regardless of whether you're in the lifestyle and you're trying to maintain or you're in the weight loss mode, there has to be a balance. Just that ratio might be skewed a little bit differently when you're trying to maintain, more feasting when you're trying to maintain, which is awesome, as opposed to more fasting and less feasting when you're trying to lose, but still having some feasting to prevent that starvation mode reaction from happening.
I think that's great. We should probably do a whole podcast just on that, because that's the trouble that so many people get themselves into, is what you talk about and talk every single day. I hear you talk about people getting themselves into those calorie deficits, just lower calories and lower calories and lower calories and lower calories. And there's at a certain point, there's nowhere to go. So your approach of just having specific time windows and frames so your body can regulate itself is brilliant.
Yeah, and just to add one little part on that, you see a lot of fitness enthusiasts, influencers, because they're so used to, well, and having experience, with a bodybuilder yourself, like when you're in that cut mode, you dialed out back your calories a little bit, and then eventually you have to keep dialing it back. That's different because their initial dial back wasn't that dramatic. And so in that situation, yeah, you just continue to decrease a little bit more and you'll lose some more, and you play that game. That's really confusing to a lot of these these fitness enthusiasts and influencers, because they don't understand that with GLP-1 world, it's not a small deficit that's happening to these people. These people are going on a massive deficit. So there's no more room to drop. And they're triggering this massive metabolic reaction, which is a literal survival situation. Very, very different. And I know when I hear a lot of these influencers talking, they just don't understand the difference. When you're not on GLP-1s, when your body wants to burn 2,000, it would take an insane amount of mental toughness for you to day in and day out eat 1,000, because you have this body that wants to eat. And just look at bodybuilders when they're trying to cut. I mean, it's one of the hardest things mentally for them to do, even with all the crap they're taking. This is before GLP-1s, to be able to survive. Yeah, to be able to survive those periods. So, it's really cool to kind of see all this stuff together. And with our podcast in the future, it's going to be exciting to get this information out, to get people corrected in their understanding.
I think that one will really change people's way. I think that one should probably be our next one. That's going to change the course of people's journeys, just understanding the differences. And you're so knowledgeable in those. The next question we have is, my doctor moved me up on the dose every month. Now I'm at 15 and I just started. I have a significant amount of weight to lose. How do I go about dosing down? I'm scared I might have maxed out my dose.
Man, this is a controversial one. This is a juicy one, because I got to be careful. It's not in my discipline to tell people any medical advice, right? I'm a DC. I educate, but this is so interesting, what's happening. So I'll just share what I see, and I see it all the time. People get, not even necessarily only when they hit 15, if we're talking about Tirzepatide or 2.4 with Semaglutide, but they get to the max dose or they get near the max dose. Something happens where all of a sudden it's like the medication stops working, and the patient will describe, it's like, whoa, like I don't feel like it's working. And it happens sometime relative to right when I increased or not too long afterwards. And it's like, okay, I'm seeing this way too often. And there is no literature that I'm aware of that says this can happen, right? This sort of like receptor burnout. So what do I think is happening? Because there's no research to prove it. Receptor burnout, down regulation. It's not that you're breaking the receptors. It's the body inherently develops a resistance to anything. And this is well established with medications, if we're just talking about medications, but it happens with hormones. It happens with all sorts of things. It's a basic way to survive. I think we kind of touched on this a little bit before in the last episode, like a down-regulate inflammation can do this. High levels of inflammation down-regulate all sorts of various receptors. That one's interesting because it'll happen on multiple receptor sites. But in this case, if we're talking about a drug, it's just the receptor that it acts on. And so I'm convinced that it's happening with GLP-1s. And so you run that risk on higher doses is sort of down-regulating those receptors. So, okay, that's what I think is happening. And so what do I think the solution is? Well, we have to table diabetics because that's a different beast. If you are a diabetic and you are using the GLP-1 to keep your blood sugar under control, that's very different because now decreasing your medication causes your blood sugar to rise, which creates an immediate harm for your health. So that's a whole nother conversation that we'll just table for now, because I do think that would be somewhere in the vicinity of the right approach for them when done carefully. But for an obese individual or an overweight individual, there's no immediate harm with reducing your medication. I mean, you were obese before you got on the GLP-1s. It's like the word, there really isn't. You're not going to miss an injection or decrease your dose and go out and stuff your face to the point where you're going to cause that. It's not going to happen. And having coached patients where my medical practitioners are weaning them down, it's actually always surprising to them to see how like it actually takes a while before the hunger comes back. A lot longer than they would think, and even a lot longer than I would think too, because I would think within a week or two it comes back, and for whatever reason it's different for every individual, but it takes time. And trying to make sense with that, and the half-life is interesting, but nonetheless, I do think that the solution for the non-diabetic, if they're at this point, if they feel like this has happened to them, is to do what I like to call a medication reset, which would be different than a metabolic reset. A metabolic reset would be to solve the earlier problem of the starvation mode, which is slowly increasing your calories over time. But a medication reset is intuitively, like the name implies, a break from the medication so that you can develop some sensitivity to it. And there's so many positive outcomes. Again, I know we don't have too much time for this one, but I'll just kind of briefly touch on that. The obvious being, we need to get you resensitized to the GLP-1s again. So that's goal number one. Goal number two is, well, if you believe in the goal that me and my medical staff encourage for people, which is to eventually get to the point where you need no GLP-1s or micro doses, like much lower doses to maintain. Well, if that's your goal, well, logically speaking, let's resensitize you and get you back. And hopefully you can get back to feeling what you were feeling on a lower dose, which is, by the way, what happens a lot of the times. So that's reason number two. And then reason number three is really, really interesting. This is the mindset piece, because mindset is one of my 10 pillars. I need individuals to feel hunger again. I need them to feel the challenge again, right? So food chatter in the beginning was uncontrollable. Because remember, take a step back, like food chatter is normal. A healthy individual has some amount of hunger, has some amount of cravings, even when you're really healthy, right? And if you gave in to every single craving, you would eventually become unhealthy. And we know that, right? That's how you would become obese from an originally healthy situation. But for these individuals with obesity or whatever you want to call it, they have uncontrollable food chatter. So it's pathologic. They can't control it. And, the mechanisms behind why that happens, insulin resistance and many other things, but insulin resistance being the primary driver. So with these individuals, you use the GLP-1 in the beginning to clear that up so that you can regain control and initiate all this change. And that's all great. But my concern with having too much suppression is that you weaken this ability for you mentally to tolerate hunger. Because if the end all goal is to get you to stability and health, that includes some amount of mental toughness for you to be able to say no to delicious donuts when they get presented to you on Thursday and you did not plan for donuts to be thrown in front of your face and they happen to be one of your favorite donuts and you know that this Saturday is a big splurge and you want to be like, "No, I'm good. I could have that right now because I'm healthy, but I'm good because I'm going to be splurging on Saturday." Like that's called mental toughness and or whatever you want to call it, mental strength, self-control, yada yada yada. It's for you to be able to do that. Yes, you have to have mental toughness, but you also have to have mental toughness that exceeds your body's desire, right? And that's the body. That's not your mental toughness. That's your insulin resistance. That's your inflammation. And that's, again, it's a losing battle in the beginning, and that's the disease, and that's the need for the medication. So, one simple way to kind of plan for the future is just reminding individuals, what does hunger feel like again? What does that look like? And then I would say a small kind of part 4 to this would be reason number 4 would be let's test the waters. Let's see how hungry you do get when you're off the medication. It might be a lot less than you realize, which is sort of really rewarding too. And so there's just a lot of positivity that happens, I think, with this. And again, the worst thing that can happen is the person just uncontrollably, and they always think this, starts just massively piling food in their mouths. And okay, let's just say that happens. You can always get back on the medication, because we're not talking about diabetics. So I think that for people in that situation that are experiencing it's not working anymore, where do I go? Instead of asking questions of like, which is what they always ask, can I start metformin? Can I start another medication? Can I add this? Can I add that? I'm like, instead of adding more medications, which to me is kind of like starving yourself more, it would be similar to that. Let's take a step back and just rework the tools that we have in front of us and start incorporating lifestyle. And so that's where the whole concept comes from. And, how do you do that is a whole nother long conversation. Basically, long story short, if what I've noticed is, because then the next question is, all right, Dr. Jones, I agree with you. I want to do this. Now, how do I not blow up? Let's just say I don't, start massively uncontrollably eating. Aren't I going to start gaining a bunch of weight? You would think. And I think most people, if they did this on their own, would start gaining weight, a certain amount to a lot, right? It's going to vary. And so I like to look at my practitioners will kind of create like a schedule for them, so to speak, or kind of in combo with the patient's comfort level, right? Generally slow and steady. If you're on 15, don't just go to 0, maybe 5 milligrams a week or something like that. So it's a 3 to 4 week process. You could certainly go as slow as you want. But then while they're doing that, you start adding the fasting, you start adding the keto, you start adding all these other pieces. And I'm looking for this net neutral effect because I realize your body's insulin resistance is going to start increasing. And so if I can kind of replace that effect that the medication was doing with lifestyle, then it seems like if I can just get stability, which is what I usually do, now they're doing really good. Now they're resensitizing and yada, yada, yada. And then we can start them up again. And so usually we can actually do that with not as much weight gain as you would think. Usually not at all. And then sometimes they're doing that at the same time as the metabolic reset too as well. So that's a very often starting point for us is taking a patient and doing a metabolic and a medication reset.
I think that's the most interesting part about you in particular and your clinic is that tailoring, you working with practitioners and together coming up with this plan that's just tailored individually to that patient and thinking of these things that are outside the box. Because like she said, what works for one person is not going to work for another person. I think that's what's uniquely different about what you, your team, and your company provide to GLP-1 people and helping them navigate all of those pathways. It's a very unique approach to it. You are literally the first doctor that I've heard that has yourself and your team having that holistic approach that one's shoe is not necessarily going to fit every single person. We're going to tailor this and let's try this. And if it doesn't work, we have these safety nets in place and these parameters, and you're not in this alone. And you're not trying to just Google the next biggest phase. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. And you come in there with a plan. It's a completely unique perspective.
Awesome. Yeah. No, it's a lot of fun. It really is.
Well, that's it for the questions. And if anybody has any more questions for Dr. Jones, feel free to ask them on there in our next episode. Maybe we'll talk about one of yours.
Yeah, that'll be cool. All right. Thanks, Candace.